In this video, you will learn how to print a dry point plate. Now that you have prepared your ink, created your plate, sanded your caster wheel, soaked your paper, and set up your registration system, you are ready to print. You will apply the ink to the surface of the plate with a cardboard chip or plastic card. The ink will then be wiped off until you can see through the plate, yet leaving some color on the plate. This tone in the negative space of the image area is called plate tone. The burr will retain the ink in the line area. Once printed, you will see plate tone and that the etched lines have a distinctive velvety look. Owing to the nature of the delicacy of the burr, the dry point is usually made in only small additions before the burr is crushed by the pressure of the intaglio press, or in our case, the caster wheel. Dry point is often combined with other intaglio techniques, monoprinting, relief blocks, and so on. So here is my setup. What I'm going to do now is put on some gloves, but I'll probably do that after I mix my ink. I'm going to add a little bit of oil, the vegetable oil, and always when you take your ink out of its container, if you pre-mixed it, you're going to have to make sure you mix it really, really well with your palette knife. The oil creates a viscosity, which will make it easier for you to ink your plate and thus wipe it off. So, as you see, I'm just going to keep mixing it with my palette knife until I feel like the consistency is smooth and also very homogenized. So I'm holding this up so that you can see the quality of the ink and the viscosity. Basically, what I like to think of is honey. So you're going to pull your palette knife up and then make sure that you see that the ink kind of doesn't drip, but almost like expands with the motion of the palette knife being moved up from the plate into the air. Because intaglio in its nature is very messy and tactile, you'll want to put on gloves. Make sure you have plenty of those squares pre-cut up, so I just make a bunch of them. Now, with your card, you're going to scoop up the ink and you're going to wipe it across the surface. You want to make sure you have an even coating all the way on the entire surface of the plate so that you get plate tone as well as that beautiful line quality after you've wiped away all of the ink. You don't need a ton of ink because otherwise you're one, wasting ink, but also it's going to take a while for you to wipe off the ink. Using a flat hand, you're going to want to start to take off the ink. Now, I specifically put a lot of ink on to show you how much you do not need. But you'll get used to the act of wiping down a plate, which is part of the hard technical nature of dry point or any of the etching techniques. And the reason I have the squares rather large is so that, as you can see, I'm just folding it over to conserve paper. You can also use newspaper or telephone book pages if you have that available, but since I have a lot of newsprint, I like to use that. You want to make sure that the paper is also very soft, so that's why I recommend newsprint, newspaper, or telephone books. Traditionally, one would actually pre-wipe the paper, or I'm sorry, the plate with something called a tarlatan. But because tarlatans are very specifically bought at a print shop or online, and you can ask me where to buy them, they are usually in bulk and it's a fabric, kind of like cheesecloth, but I don't have students buy that purely because if you're trying an etching once, then you don't want to spend a lot of money on the Tarlatan. So now as you can see, I'm starting to wipe away all of the ink and you can start seeing through the plate. So once you I would keep holding the plate up to a light source just so I can see how much I've wiped off. Now, my tendency is to do what's called over wiping, where I take out way too much ink. Do not do that because you will not be able to print a consistent print. So, how do I avoid that? I make sure that I just keep looking up at the light source, and you want to keep more ink on the surface of the plate than you think you do. So here is a pretty good amount of ink left on the surface, and what you're going to also think about as you're printing is you want to make sure that at first I like to have more ink than I need. Then as you print, you're going to keep doing the same process like you do in all printmaking, where you're going to continue to ink up the surface, but you'll get kind of used to it. So make sure you also work on some scrap paper. Also, before putting your print down onto its registration board or the plate, you want to make sure to wipe down all of the edges of the actual inked plate itself, because that will create what's called a plate mark, and it's not necessarily something that you should have as part of the art of a etching. So I'm now clipping my paper into the registration system, and you can see I already put down my plate. Plates tend to always be inky on the back, and that's why it's really a good idea to have that clean acetate. Now, you're going to use the caster wheel as your print press. So you can buy a cheap caster wheel at Harbor Freight, and I think mine was something like $3. You're going to rock over top of your plate area the caster wheel. I usually like to do it so I think I've done a lot, and then I do a couple more passes. So I'll always do my passing on or rolling onto first the area that is covered up with the newsprint, and then so I can get even more pressure, what I like to do is take the newsprint off and start going directly onto the back of the paper. You want to make sure that you're not too rough with the paper, otherwise you can sometimes rip the paper since it's soaked with water. And make sure that you do not have the paper so it's dripping wet, but you want to make sure that it's still a little moist. You can slowly, because the paper is clipped, you can slowly kind of peek at your inking too, and then just continue to ink until you see that you have actually inked over the whole surface. The other thing is, as you're doing this, creating pressure, you'll see where the plate is onto the back. Now there is my first print, and it's very well inked. The top